January 14, 1942, Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. The sun had barely crested the eastern horizon when the men of the SS Alan Jackson felt the concussion ripple through the hull, a sound like thunder trapped underwater, followed by the sickening groan of buckling steel. The tanker, laden with 70 barrels of Colombian crude oil, hemorrhaged fire into the winter Atlantic. On the beach at Buxton, families watched in horror as silhouettes burned against the dawn, the flames visible from breakfast tables where coffee had gone cold in trembling hands. The war, distant until now, had arrived with devastating intimacy. Kapitän Leutnant Reinhard Hartigan, commanding officer of U-66, watched through his periscope with clinical satisfaction. The torpedo had struck precisely where he intended, amidships, at the waterline where the explosion would rupture fuel tanks and transform cargo into weapon. He had been prowling these waters for 6 days, operating with an audacity that would have been suicidal mere months before. But this was not the heavily patrolled shipping lanes of 1941. This was the American coast in the opening weeks of war, and it was, in the parlance that would echo through Kriegsmarine officers' messes from Brest to Lorient, Die zweite glückliche Zeit, the second happy time. The statistics tell a story of systematic devastation. Between January and August 1942, German U-boats operating off the American eastern seaboard, in the Gulf of Mexico, and throughout the Caribbean sank 609 merchant vessels, totaling 3.1 million gross registered tons. The numbers, sterile in their precision, conceal the human mathematics of war. Approximately 5,000 merchant seamen killed, millions of gallons of fuel oil feeding the Atlantic rather than Allied war machines, and a strategic calculation by Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz that the balance of industrial attrition favored Nazi Germany. Dönitz, the architect of Germany's submarine warfare doctrine, had performed his own arithmetic. His staff calculated that if U-boats could maintain a sinking rate exceeding 700,000 tons per month, Allied shipbuilding capacity, even accounting for American industrial might, could not replace losses quickly enough to sustain the flow of material necessary for prosecuting war in Europe. The mathematics seemed irrefutable. Each Type 7 U-boat cost approximately 4.5 million Reichsmarks and required 9 months to construct. Each merchantman represented significantly greater investment in time, steel, and labor. The equation favored the attacker. But Dönitz's calculations, meticulous as they were, failed to account for a revolution in naval warfare that was already gestating in American shipyards. A revolution that would transform the strategic equation through mass production, technological innovation, and a radical reimagining of how aircraft carriers could be deployed. To understand the crisis of 1942, one must first comprehend the geometry of maritime warfare in the Atlantic. The convoy system, instituted with hard-learned lessons from the First World War, concentrated merchant vessels into groups of 30 to 60 ships arrayed in columns shepherded by destroyers and corvettes whose mission was threefold: detect submarines before they could maneuver into attack position, drive them away from the convoy's vulnerable flanks, and, if opportunity permitted, destroy them. The system worked after a fashion. A U-boat attempting to attack a convoy faced the problem of approach. It must intercept a moving target while itself moving, calculate deflection angles for torpedoes traveling at 44 knots over distances of up to 4 kilometers, and do so while potentially under counterattack from escorts whose depth charges could crush a pressure hull at depths exceeding 200 meters. But the system contained a fatal vulnerability, the air gap. Convoys enjoyed air cover when within range of land-based patrol aircraft, roughly 500 nautical miles from shore. In the mid-Atlantic, a void of approximately 600 miles existed where no aircraft could reach. Here, in what submariners called the Black Pit, U-boats could operate on the surface, using their diesel engines to achieve speeds of 17 knots, fast enough to pursue convoys, reposition ahead of their projected course, and submerge for attack. Surface escorts, limited to sonar with effective ranges of 1,500 yards and visual observation hampered by weather and darkness, faced an asymmetric battle. Dönitz exploited this geometry with Rudeltaktik, wolf-pack tactics. Intelligence from B-Dienst codebreakers would identify convoy routes. U-boat command would vector submarines into patrol lines across projected convoy paths. Upon contact, the first boat would shadow at maximum range, transmitting position reports. As darkness fell, boats would converge, attacking from multiple vectors, overwhelming escorts through numerical superiority. The tactic proved devastatingly effective. During the March 1943 battles surrounding convoys, SC-122 and HX-229, 40 U-boats sank 21 ships totaling 141,000 tons over 4 days of continuous combat. The Western Approach's tactical unit analyzed the engagement and reached a chilling conclusion. If present trends continued, the convoy system would collapse within months. Yet even as analysts drafted their pessimistic assessments, the solution was taking shape on ways at shipyards from Seattle to Brooklyn, a solution that would prove as revolutionary in its strategic implications as the submarine threat it was designed to counter. The escort carrier, officially designated CVE, unofficially known as Jeep Carrier, Woolworth Carrier, or with dark humor, combustible, vulnerable, expendable, emerged not from grand strategic vision but from pragmatic necessity. The concept had antecedents. The British had experimented with merchant ships fitted with flight decks, creating vessels like HMS Audacity, which proved the principle that even a handful of aircraft could dramatically alter the tactical equation of convoy defense before being sunk by U-751 in December 1941. American naval architects embraced the concept with characteristic industrial enthusiasm. The design parameters were elegantly simple. Take a merchant ship hull, specifically the C-3 cargo vessel design already in mass production, and graft onto it the minimum infrastructure necessary to operate aircraft. The resulting vessel would be slow with a maximum speed of 19 knots. It would carry fewer than 30 aircraft, compared to the 90 or more aboard fleet carriers. Its armament would be modest, a single 5-inch gun, multiple 40mm Bofors, anti-aircraft mounts, and whatever protection its aircraft could provide. But it would be cheap, roughly 1/6 the cost of a fleet carrier, and fast to build. The Kaiser Shipbuilding Company in Vancouver, Washington, pioneered construction techniques that reduced build time from 14 months to 3 months. Prefabrication, modular assembly, and round-the-clock shifts transformed shipbuilding from craft to production line. By war's end, American yards would launch 78 escort carriers. The USS Bogue, commissioned in September 1942, exemplified the type. Her statistics read like a study in calculated compromise: 495 feet overall length, displacement of 7,800 tons, flight deck 442 feet long and 80 feet wide, barely adequate for operating the Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers that would become her primary striking weapon. Her crew of 890 men lived in spaces that would have seemed cramped even by merchant marine standards. Aviation fuel capacity limited operations. The absence of armor meant that a single well-placed torpedo would almost certainly prove fatal. None of this mattered. The escort carrier was not designed to fight enemy surface fleets or participate in the great carrier battles of the Pacific. Its mission was specific, limited, and absolutely vital: close the air gap over Atlantic convoys and transform the mathematics of submarine warfare. The aircraft that launched from escort carrier decks in 1943 bore little resemblance to the biplanes that had pioneered naval aviation 2 decades prior. The Grumman TBF-1 Avenger, though designed as a torpedo bomber for strikes against surface vessels, proved magnificently adaptable to anti-submarine warfare. With a crew of 3, pilot, turret gunner, and radioman bombardier, and powered by a Wright R2600 radial engine producing 1,700 horsepower, the Avenger could remain airborne for over 5 hours, patrol at 145 knots, and carry a weapons load tailored to submarine hunting. But the Avenger's true revolution lay not in its airframe, but in its electronics. By 1943, production aircraft carried ASV Mark III radar, a centimetric system operating at 3,000 megahertz with a pulse repetition frequency of 750 hertz. The specifications sound arcane until one understands their implications. This radar could detect a surfaced submarine at ranges exceeding 10 nautical miles, even in darkness or foul weather. A U-boat commander's assumption that night and storm-provided cover had become lethally obsolete. The tactical evolution proceeded in tandem with technology. Initially, Avengers carried 325-pound depth charges, effective only if dropped with precision directly over a submerged submarine, a challenging proposition given the target's ability to maneuver. But in 1943, 2 weapons transformed aerial anti-submarine warfare from harassing nuisance to lethal threat. The first was the Mark 24 acoustic homing torpedo, codenamed Fido to disguise its nature. This 680-pound weapon, dropped by parachute and propelled by an electric motor to eliminate acoustic signature, would circle upon water entry, its passive acoustic sensor listening for the distinctive sound signature of submarine propellers or diesel engines. Upon detection, it would home on the noise source with a circular error probability of less than 20 feet. U-boat commanders discovered, to their horror, that conventional evasion running silent, changing course proved ineffective. The torpedo would follow, relentless, until proximity fuse detonation shattered pressure hulls. The second innovation was the sonobuoy, a disposable acoustic sensor dropped by parachute, which would transmit underwater sounds via radio to the hunting aircraft. An Avenger could seed a suspected submarine's operating area with multiple sonobuoys, then triangulate the U-boat's position from the transmitted data. The submarine, invisible beneath the waves, had become audible. These technologies converged into doctrine. The hunter-killer group, an escort carrier, and typically 4 destroyer escorts, would operate independently of convoys, hunting U-boats based on direction-finding fixes on radio transmissions or intelligence decrypts. The carrier's aircraft would establish search patterns covering thousands of square miles. Upon detection, they would attack immediately with depth charges or rockets, driving the submarine deep, then vector surface escorts to the location for sustained prosecution with depth charges and the new Hedgehog forward-throwing mortar, which could deliver 24 projectiles in a circular pattern without the attacking ship losing sonar contact. March 16, 1943. North Atlantic, approximately 600 miles south of Iceland. Lieutenant Commander Aurelius B. Vossler, commanding officer of the destroyer Escort, USS Braunstein, studied the tactical plot with the intensity of a man solving a lethal equation. His ship, part of the hunter-killer group centered on the escort carrier USS Bogue, had been vectoring toward a direction-finding fix on U-boat radio transmissions for 6 hours. The weather was atrocious, 30-foot seas, wind gusting to 40 knots, visibility less than 2 miles in rain squalls. Standard destroyer doctrine would have suggested waiting for better conditions. But Captain Giles Short, commanding Bogue, had launched aircraft regardless. The Avenger, flown by Lieutenant, junior grade, William F. Chamberlain, had departed the carrier's pitching deck at 13:47 hours, climbed to 1,500 feet, and commenced a square search pattern centered on the last radio fix. At 15:12 hours, his radar operator reported a contact at 8 miles, bearing 273 degrees. What followed exemplified the new reality of submarine warfare. Chamberlain approached from astern, using clouds for concealment until the last moment. The U-boat, U-406, commanded by Horst Diederichs, was running surfaced, charging batteries, its watch focused on the horizon rather than the sky. The first indication of attack came when lookouts heard the Avenger's engine note changing as Chamberlain pushed into a shallow dive. Diederichs, a veteran of 31 months of combat operations, reacted with practiced efficiency, crash dive, ordering all hands below, sealing hatches. But the Avenger was already in its attack run. Chamberlain released 4 depth charges in a stick set for shallow detonation, 50 feet. The submarine was perhaps 30 feet below the surface when the first charge exploded. The physics of underwater explosion are unforgiving. Water, being incompressible, transmits shock waves with brutal efficiency. A 325-pound depth charge produces a pressure pulse exceeding 5,000 pounds per square inch at close range, sufficient to rupture the double hull construction of a Type semi-C U-boat, spring hull plates, shatter valves, and incapacitate crew through sheer concussion. U-406 suffered catastrophic damage. Diederich surfaced, hoping to flee on diesel engines, only to find Braunstein closing at flank speed. The destroyer Escort opened fire with her 3-inch guns at 4,000 yards. The engagement lasted 7 minutes. Diederich, recognizing that his boat was doomed, steering damaged, unable to dive, ordered scuttling charges set and crew to abandon ship. Vossler, in an act that spoke to the strange honor that sometimes prevailed even in industrialized warfare, ceased fire and maneuvered to recover survivors. Of U-406's 49-man crew, 48 were pulled from the frigid Atlantic. One man, trapped below during the emergency surface, went down with his boat. This engagement, one of hundreds that occurred across the Atlantic in 1943, illustrated the transformed tactical environment. A U-boat operating in the air gap was no longer safe. The combination of radar-equipped aircraft, acoustic homing weapons, and aggressive surface escorts had inverted the hunter-prey relationship. Gross Admiral Dönitz maintained a daily accounting of what he termed the tonnage battle, the arithmetic that would determine victory or defeat in the Atlantic. His staff compiled reports from returning U-boats, analyzed Allied convoy routing, and calculated exchange rates, tons of Allied shipping sunk versus U-boats lost. Through early 1943, the numbers favored Germany. January, 203 128 tons sunk, 6 U-boats lost. February, 328 tons sunk, 19 boats lost. March, 627 377 tons sunk, a record, but at a cost of 15 boats. But April marked an inflection point. Sinkings declined to 344,680 tons, while U-boat losses climbed to 15. May proved catastrophic, 264,152 tons sunk versus 41 U-boats destroyed, a loss rate of 30% of boats at sea. Dönitz, confronted with mathematics that now favored the Allies, made the most difficult decision of his career. On May 24, 1943, he withdrew U-boats from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The decision reverberated through German strategic planning. For the first time in the war, the Kriegsmarine acknowledged that it could not command even a portion of the Atlantic sea lanes. The consequences cascaded. Without the threat of U-boat interdiction, Allied shipping could transit with near impunity. The build-up for eventual invasion of Europe could proceed unimpeded. The strategic blockade that Germany hoped would force Britain to terms had failed. What had changed? The analysis reveals a convergence of factors, but escort carriers featured prominently. By May 1943, 6 American escort carriers were operating in the Atlantic, supplemented by 5 British CVEs. Between them, they flew hundreds of patrols monthly, closing the air gap and extending air coverage across previously undefended ocean. Statistics compiled by the U.S. Navy's Anti-Submarine Warfare Operations Research Group demonstrated the impact. Convoys with air cover suffered loss rates 1/5 those of unescorted convoys. U-boats detected by aircraft faced destruction rates 6 times higher than those engaged only by surface escorts, but beyond statistics lay psychological impact. U-boat crews who had hunted with relative impunity for 2 years now faced a patrol profile of escalating lethality. Former Captain Lieutenant Peter Kramer, who survived the war after 5 patrols, would later describe the evolution. In 1941, we feared destroyers but could evade them. In 1942, we feared aircraft, but they were rare. By 1943, we feared everything: the sky, the sea, the very act of surfacing, to charge batteries or transmit position reports. We had become the prey. The loss rate confirmed his assessment. In 1942, approximately 5% of U-boats at sea were lost per month. By the second half of 1943, the rate exceeded 40%. For individual crewmen, the implications were stark. A U-boat sailor faced roughly a 75% chance of death over the course of typical multi-patrol service. This exceeded loss rates of bomber crews, infantry assault units, or virtually any other combatant role in the war. While submarine crews faced death in the Atlantic, shipyard workers in America executed an industrial achievement that would prove as decisive as any battle. The American shipbuilding industry in 1942 faced a challenge of staggering scope: replace losses that had reduced available merchant tonnage by millions of tons, while simultaneously building an amphibious fleet for Pacific Island campaigns, constructing destroyer escorts for convoy protection, and launching escort carriers to close the air gap. The response redefined industrial warfare. Henry J. Kaiser, an industrialist with no shipbuilding experience but a genius for production engineering, pioneered techniques that transformed naval construction. The Liberty ship, a standardized 441-foot cargo vessel, could be built in an average of 42 days by late 1943. Some yards achieved construction times of less than 2 weeks for individual vessels. Kaiser's Vancouver yard launched 30 escort carriers between April 1942 and July 1943, a production rate averaging one every 5 weeks. This industrial capacity inverted Dunitz's tonnage calculations. In 1942, American yards alone launched 8.1 million tons of merchant shipping, far exceeding global losses. In 1943, production reached 13.5 million tons. The mathematical certainty that had underwritten German submarine strategy, that sinking tonnage would exceed replacement capacity, had been demolished, not by military action but by industrial organization. The escort carriers themselves exemplified this production philosophy. Unlike fleet carriers, which required specialized facilities and skilled craftsmen for complex machinery installations, escort carriers utilized merchant marine components wherever possible. Their steam turbine plants, rated at 9,000 shaft horsepower, were standard merchant marine units produced by multiple manufacturers. Flight deck catapults were simplified designs requiring less precision engineering than fleet carrier systems. Damage control systems prioritized ease of maintenance over redundancy. Critics, and there were many within the Navy's carrier aviation community, derided these compromises. Escort carriers were slow, unstable in heavy seas, vulnerable to damage, and limited in operational capability. But such criticism missed the strategic point. Escort carriers were not meant to be optimal. They were meant to be sufficient and to be produced in quantities that would saturate the Atlantic with air coverage. By August 1943, the operational deployment demonstrated the strategy's success. 9 escort carriers operated in the Atlantic, supplemented by British CVEs and increasingly effective land-based patrol aircraft. The air gap had effectively ceased to exist. U-boats could no longer operate on the surface except in extreme circumstances. Their effective patrol radius, limited by the need to remain submerged, contracted dramatically. The Hunter had been caged, September 20th, 1943. Bay of Biscay, approximately 200 miles northwest of Cape Finisterre. Korvettenkapitän Friedrich Guggenberger, commanding U-532, attempted the transit that had become a death run, passage through the Bay of Biscay, between German-occupied France and the open Atlantic. Allied aircraft operating from bases in England patrolled these waters with increasing density. Guggenberger, a holder of the Knight's Cross for sinking the carrier HMS Ark Royal in 1941, understood the risks but had no alternative route to his patrol area. At 14:23 hours, a Handley Page Halifax bomber from RAF Squadron 58, piloted by Flying Officer I.C. Jackson, detected U-513 on radar at 12 miles. Guggenberger, monitoring the submarine's METOX radar warning receiver, received no indication of the Halifax's approach. The British had switched to centimetric radar that METOX could not detect. The first warning came when lookouts spotted the bomber emerging from cloud at 3 miles, already committed to attack. What followed was execution. Jackson's bombardier released 6 depth charges in a perfect straddle. 3 charges exploded within lethal radius. U-513's pressure hull failed catastrophically. The submarine went down in less than 90 seconds, carrying all 54 crew to the bottom. This engagement, routine by late 1943 standards, embodied the transformation of Atlantic warfare. U-boats could no longer transit safely even to their patrol areas. Losses on passage through the Bay of Biscay reached levels that forced Dönitz to order submarines to remain submerged for entire transits, relying on snorkel breathing devices, a measure that reduced passage speed to 6 knots and extended transit time to weeks. Meanwhile, hunter-killer groups hunted with increasing sophistication. The group centered on USS Card, commanded by Captain Arnold J. Isbell, developed tactics that combined signals intelligence, aggressive patrol, and sustained prosecution. Between August and October 1943, Card's aircraft and escorts sank 9 U-boats. Similar results occurred across multiple groups. The USS Bogue score reached 10 U-boats destroyed. USS Core's group accounted for 13. The tactical evolution proved as significant as the kills themselves. Hunter-killer groups had learned to exploit every advantage. They would approach U-boat operating areas at night, launch dawn patrols to catch submarines, surfaced for battery charging, and sustained contact through crew rotation and aerial refueling techniques that kept at least 1 aircraft over the target area continuously. U-boats attempting to flee underwater faced exhaustion of battery power, followed by forced surface into waiting attack aircraft. Captured U-boat personnel, interrogated by Allied intelligence officers, revealed the psychological toll. One survivor, a machinist from U-664, sunk in August 1943, described the final hours. "We knew when we heard aircraft engines that we would die. Diving was no escape. The aircraft would circle, drop markers, bring their ships. We could only wait underwater, silent, listening to propellers drawing closer. When the depth charges began, we prayed for quick death." The human cost of the Atlantic campaign defies easy comprehension. Numbers provide structure. Of approximately 40,000 men who served in U-boats during the war, 28,000 never returned, a loss rate of 70%. This exceeded casualties in virtually any other service branch of any combatant nation. For comparison, RAF Bomber Command, notorious for its losses, suffered a fatality rate of 44%. German infantry on the Eastern Front experienced casualties around 30%. But statistics fail to capture the experiential reality of submarine warfare. A U-boat crew lived in conditions of sustained privation and terror. The interior of a Type CIC submarine, the standard operational boat, measured 220 feet long with a pressure hull diameter of 15 feet. Into this space were crammed 50 men, 23 torpedoes, and their handling equipment: diesel engines, electric motors, batteries, fresh water tanks, fuel oil bunkers, and provisions for patrols lasting up to 12 weeks. Crew lived among their weapons. Torpedoes in the forward room served as bunks, sleeping surfaces, and dining tables. The submarine had 1 toilet, and only 1 crew member at a time could use the shower, located in the galley. The air, thick with humidity from respiration and mechanical systems, reeked of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and mildew. Crew wore the same clothing for weeks. Food, initially fresh, degraded to canned rations and bread so moldy it had to be scraped before eating. Through this endured, the men faced death in forms both sudden and prolonged. A depth charge attack could rupture the hull in an instant, flooding compartments faster than watertight doors could seal, sending the boat to the bottom in seconds. Or damage could be incremental: cracked hull plates allowing slow flooding, failed pumps, depleted batteries, contaminated air as carbon dioxide levels climbed beyond sustainable levels. Some crews died over hours, waiting in darkness as their submarine settled toward crushed depth. For Allied merchant seamen, the equation was equally brutal. Torpedoed at night in winter North Atlantic waters, survival time measured in minutes. Many ships sank so quickly that crew had no opportunity to launch lifeboats. Those who made it to life rafts faced exposure, thirst, and the statistical probability that no rescue would arrive before death from hypothermia or dehydration. Of approximately 30,000 British merchant seamen who died during the war, the majority perished in the Atlantic. The moral calculus of this warfare troubled some participants. Peter Kremer, the U-boat commander who survived the war, would later write with ambiguity about his actions. "We sank ships carrying food, fuel, equipment that sustained Britain. We killed men doing their duty as we did ours. Was this murder or warfare? I believed we fought justly. I believe it still, though I dream sometimes of men drowning in burning oil and wake uncertain." By December 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had effectively concluded, though combat continued until Germany's surrender in May 1945. The strategic verdict was unambiguous. Allied merchant shipping losses declined from 600,000 tons per month in late 1942 to less than 100,000 tons by mid-1943, and to negligible levels thereafter. Conversely, U-boat construction, which peaked at 30 boats per month, could not offset losses that exceeded 20 boats monthly through 1944. The escort carrier's contribution to this outcome was decisive. Analysis by post-war naval historians attributes approximately 35% of U-boat kills to aircraft action or combined air-surface attacks, a proportion that rises to over 50% when accounting for U-boats damaged by aircraft and subsequently destroyed by surface forces. The psychological effect multiplied this direct impact. U-boats forced to remain submerged could not effectively pursue convoys, could not cover operating areas, could not fulfill their strategic mission of tonnage warfare. Admiral Sir Max Horton, Commander-in-Chief of Western Approaches, assessed the transformation with characteristic bluntness in a December 1943 dispatch. "The hunter has become the hunted." The submarine, which began this war as capital ship of the German fleet, has been reduced to a target of opportunity. Air power has proven the decisive factor, and the escort carrier the decisive platform. The strategic implications extended beyond the Atlantic. The defeat of the U-boat campaign ensured that American industrial capacity could flow unimpeded to European and Mediterranean theaters. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, Allied forces had accumulated in Britain 1.5 million men, 12,000 aircraft, and 5,000 vessels, a concentration of power impossible had the U-boat threat remained viable. The invasion of Normandy and the subsequent liberation of Western Europe occurred only because the Atlantic sea lanes remained open. Moreover, the escort carrier concept proved transportable. The lessons learned in Atlantic anti-submarine warfare transferred to the Pacific, where escort carriers supported amphibious operations, provided close air support for ground forces, and supplemented fleet carriers in striking operations. Of the 78 escort carriers built by the United States, many served in the Pacific, where their utility as aviation platforms for secondary missions validated the design philosophy: specialized capability, mass-produced. Sufficient for purpose by May 7, 1945, Flensburg, Germany. Gross Admiral Dönitz, now briefly head of the German state following Hitler's suicide, transmitted the final order to U-boats still at sea. Cease all offensive operations. Surface and proceed to designated Allied ports for surrender. Of 375 U-boats operational at war's end, 219 complied with surrender orders. The remaining 156 were scuttled by their crews, a final act of defiance against the weight of industrial and technological superiority that had destroyed the U-boat force. The final accounting was compiled by British and American naval intelligence in the months following surrender. The statistics formed an epitaph for the U-boat arm: 783 U-boats lost to enemy action, 632 sunk, 151 damaged beyond repair. Of 40,000 men who had served, 28,000 dead, 5,000 captured. Loss rates that made submarine service the most lethal assignment in any military force in history. The German U-boat Offensive had sunk approximately 2 SAS-800 Allied merchant vessels and 175 naval combatants, a total of 14.5 million tons of shipping. In raw numbers, a stunning achievement. But set against Allied shipbuilding capacity, which launched 42 million tons of new merchant vessels, the tonnage war became a brutal calculus of industrial attrition that Germany could not win. The Escort carrier stood as both symbol and instrument of this victory. 78 vessels built rapidly, operated economically, crewed by men who learned their trade in wartime rather than peacetime, had helped close the air gap and transform submarine warfare from strategic threat to tactical problem. They were never elegant vessels. They served without the glory accorded to fleet carriers that won the Pacific battles. Many were scrapped immediately after the war, deemed surplus to peacetime requirements, but for a critical 18 months, from late 1942 through mid-1944, they proved sufficient. Sufficient to protect convoys, sufficient to hunt submarines, sufficient to ensure that American industrial power could flow across the Atlantic, and, ultimately, sufficient to help secure victory. In the end, the Battle of the Atlantic was won not by superior courage, both sides fought with desperate determination, nor by superior individual technology, but by the ability to produce platforms and weapons in quantities that overwhelmed the enemy's capacity to respond. The Escort carrier, dismissed by some as a compromise design, exemplified the industrial philosophy that won World War II: not perfection, but adequacy; not excellence, but sufficiency; not craftsmanship, but mass production. And in the gray North Atlantic waters, where 28,000 German submariners rest in unmarked graves alongside thousands of Allied merchant seamen, the lesson remains: in industrial warfare, the side that can build faster than the enemy can destroy will ultimately prevail. The mathematics are implacable, the human cost immeasurable, the strategic verdict final.